Hi, I'm Ahmed Ali and welcome to Worldwrite. In this Views of the News programme, the issue is racism and football, something which seems to have become a media obsession. We are delighted to have in the studio lecturer and writer on the subject, Stuart Waiton, to respond to some of our questions.
Thank you for inviting me, Ahmed.
I'd like to start by asking my own question. Considering the evolution of the term racism from a society faced with active discrimination, often violent towards its ethnic minorities, to a generation conditioned to be sensitive to any verbal offence deemed racist, with a qualifier such as the word black or Asian, what is your actual definition for the term racism, and would or has any incident in football ever qualified for your definition?
It's a difficult question, Ahmed, but a useful one, I think, to consider what racism is. I tend to think it's much more useful to think about racism as being a force in society, especially when it's encouraged by powerful institutions, by politicians, talking about nationalism, for example, by discriminatory employers and by police practices, and also by immigration controls that target certain types of people, which they still do as it happens. In a society like this, when masses of people were singing racist songs at football matches, I think you could say racism was being reflected in these songs. But even then, to simply target just the song singers as a way to tackle racism would, in my opinion, completely miss the point. For example, I was involved in anti-racist politics in the 1980s, and one of the key things that we did was campaign against deportation of people who were described as sort of illegal immigrants and thrown out of the country. There wasn't a focus or a fetish on insulting language being shouted by people. It was much more about powerful institutions that were discriminating against black people. Ironically, today in Scotland, where there are few, if any, campaigns now against deportations and immigration controls, but they've now made it illegal for one football team to sing to another football team about going home. So they say, home, why don't you go home? The famine is over, why don't you go home? That has now been depicted as racist. So they can be done for racism, for singing a song, while at the same time people are still being, from certain countries, deported and seen as illegal immigrants.
Hi, my name is Nadia. What I would like to say, Stuart, is that people are not born prejudiced. Children learn by watching others. They are influenced by their behaviour. So if they see or hear racist language on the pitch, they will imitate that behaviour. And what happens on the field affects what happens off the field. Over time, children grow and absorb the lessons of the world they live in. My question then is, how can we raise children to be anti-racist if the experience they encounter and imitate are racist?
Well, Nadia, it's true that the environment we live in has an impact upon us, but I think the way you present your question is problematic. You suggest that over time children grow and absorb the lessons of the world, but this isn't really how people develop. As we grow, we read, we think, we argue, and we have all sorts of experiences of people in the world. We're not sheep, we're not animals, and we don't simply mimic other people. Unfortunately, this is how I think the authorities often think about white working class football fans in particular, who they assume are one racist song away from becoming a bigoted mob, which they're not.
Hi Stuart, I'm Suzanne. When Ferdinand decided to return a tweet slang that categorised Chelsea defender Ashley Cole, a witness, as a chalk ice, allegations followed that he'd brought the game into disrepute. Are British laws of defamation imposing a higher burden of requirements on football players' language than on other people? And do you think attacks on what footballers say and do is a way of getting a moral message across to the rest of us?
Hi Suzanne, I think you're right. There is definitely a form of moralising taking place in the various football stories we've seen in the last year or so. Witch hunts of tweets are not only happening in football, but football's been politicised in a way that makes it far more likely for issues to be raised about fans and players than perhaps about any other section of society. Interestingly, one of the reasons Ferdinand was not prosecuted in the chalk ice case as far as I can tell, is because he's black. And to prosecute a black person, for being racist to another black player would confuse the moral message that the great and the good, or the right-thinking people, as they're called, want to give to us.
Hi, I'm Jeremiah. Firstly, Stuart, I would say that racism has definitely improved, but I feel that there will always be a racial shadow, so to speak, hanging over the game. It will be under constant and often unwarranted scrutiny. And most of the figureheads do little to remove this shadow when put on the spot. For example, Sepp Blatter's denial of any racism existing on the pitch and his notion that the perpetrator and victim can simply shake hands is a poor statement at a time when racism in football has become a centre of attention yet again. He comes across as almost naive. What do you think? Secondly, do you think that by scrutinising and penalising the interaction between opposing players, freedom of speech and to a lesser extent the banter of the game will be damaged? Many feel that John Terry and especially Luis Suarez made their remarks in the heat of the moment. However, how can we tell what is genuine racism from what is genuine banter? Is it solely down to popular opinion? I think people seem to forget that saying something racial doesn't necessarily make you a racist. I'm not supporting racial comments on the field, but to compare recent events to the banana throwing of the 70s and 80s is just absurd.
On your first point, Jeremiah, I think it's sometimes difficult to tell if someone is a racist or not, simply by the language they use, which is one of the reasons that the obsession with offensive words is so stupid, in my opinion. As it happens, I think Blatter was naive, not because I disagree with him, but because he should have realised that questioning official anti-racism almost always results in a hysterical outpouring of venom and hate amongst these right-thinking people. Funnily enough, his idea that black players and white players should and do take insults on the chin and shake hands afterwards actually reflects, in my opinion, a positive idea that black and white people should be treated equally, which I always thought was the essence of anti-racism.
Hello Stuart, my name is Tiziana. I think that the Terry and Suarez case come from the heat of matches. It's not racism, because words must be contextualized. However, surely something must be done to remove offensive language and decrease the profuse insults on the pitch, to promote fair behavior and respect, not by censorship, but by how football is taught in schools and clubs. What do you think?
Children shouldn't use offensive language, in my opinion, when they play football, Tiziana. But as it happens, I actually think the obsessive teaching of anti-racism in football is often a problem. When my son started school at the age of 5, he received classes on race awareness, for example, which simply appeared to create a difference in his mind in terms of between white kids and black and Asian kids in his class, rather than them all just being treated the same. Now at the age of 12, he describes his best friend Shazib as bulletproof, basically because while all the other kids call each other names, none of them will call Shazib a name in case they're seen as being racist, which is, it's peculiar. You could see this as a victory for anti-racism, or more realistically, I think, it's a new form of difference that's being created by so-called anti-racist institutions like schools, where kids actually are almost being taught that black and Asian kids are a bit different from what they are.
Hello, my name is Falake. Now, it is said that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and to seek, receive and impart information through any media, regardless of frontiers. As a democratic nation, we like to believe in this principle. However, the John Terry incident, in my opinion, greatly contradicted that. We were looking to have him reprimanded for qualifying the C word with the word black. So my question to you, Stuart, is, as a nation, are we really as liberal as we like to think we are?
I think, Falaki, Britain has become profoundly illiberal over recent years, And as we've seen, people are being arrested for simply saying things that other people find offensive. So in Scotland, for example, a Rangers fan called Stephen Birrell was imprisoned for 8 months for calling Celtic fans nasty names. He didn't threaten anyone or incite violence. The sheriff noticed this at the time. He just called some people names on Facebook. Now he's in prison for 8 months. But this trend to lock people up because they say offensive things is not simply something that's happening in football. In fact, in a number of recent laws, there's new restrictions of this kind being introduced which affect all sorts of things, from protesting and even giving religious talks in public places. We used to arrest people for causing physical harm to others. Today, I think this has changed, and it's much more the case that we're being protected from offensive words and emotional harm. And this, I think, clearly has worrying implications for basic freedoms and indeed for democracy itself.
Hi Stuart, I'm Rosa. Passion appears to be an integral part of football, whether it's dramatic feigned injury or the highs and lows of every goal or near miss. But as can be seen from the Terry case, a passionate tongue will not go unnoticed. Do you think that the no-tolerance policy to racist language helps to deter players from progressing to racist action? Or do you think it's an example of how political correctness has gone too far? Secondly, you write about racism in football. So do you think that racism in football is a good indicator of racism in wider society? Lastly, do you think that racism has been redefined by the state?
Ironically, Rosa, official anti-racism in football appears to have only taken off when actual racism in society had already died down. This modern official anti-racism was very different to anti-racism in the 80s and was much less about challenging the racism of the authorities than it was about giving more power to the authorities to police our words and also our thoughts. So yes, I do think racism has been redefined and now simply appears to be simply about name-calling. At the same time, and equally worrying, is that black people appear to be being redefined as particularly vulnerable or as people who are more easily offended than others and people who need to be protected from nasty words, which I personally think is patronising and simply a different type of caricature.
Hi Stuart, I'm Brish. After the Ferdinand incident, Terry has been stripped of his captaincy and branded an alleged racist in the media. Shouldn't the judgment by his peers and fans be punishment enough rather than it being a court issue? And should we be allowing the police to interfere in all our rows where something offensive has been said, whether it is on TV or not?
I think you're right, Brish. The use of more law and order to deal with more issues in society is worrying. I personally think it would be much healthier if we had a culture where we challenged one another much more about not just what we say, but also what we believe. I'd hope, for example, that if a fan next to me was being racist, that I would tell him to shut up. If he was 10 foot tall and built like a tank, I may not be quite so principled, but I would hope at least that I would be.
Hello Stuart, I'm Ben. In the Terry incident we see two men arguing. This is not something confined to the football pitch. People fight and use abusive language everywhere. Would it have played out differently if it was not set in a high-pressure public context with massive attention paid to it? Isn't it just human nature to reach for offensive and racial remarks when mad? Or does football add something here?
Yes, you touch on a real bugbear of mine, Ben, the whole issue of being offensive in football. In Scotland, they've just introduced a law that makes it illegal to be offensive in football, which is madness, in my opinion, because in many respects, football is all about being offensive. That's a lot of the excitement about football as a fan is actually the offensive aspect of it. Anyway, players and more especially fans of football teams offend each other all the time. For 90 minutes, opposing players and fans become your enemy, and grown men and women go a bit mad. If I was to define what football is, I'd say football is pantomime for adults. And the fact that supposedly intelligent politicians and police chiefs take what fans say seriously is very worrying in my opinion.
Hi, I'm Eden. For many people, including myself, Stuart, the level of attention given to John Terry's racially motivated outburst was unnecessarily heavy-handed. These extreme attempts to crack down on racism seem inapplicable to a scenario that really has nothing to do with the true essence of racism, and more to do with insults as a result of a heated argument between two men on the pitch. Do you agree with the amount of media coverage this incident attracted? And in future, what kind of response from the media, if any, should be deemed acceptable when approaching potentially racially insulting language?
I agree with you, Eden. The time, the energy, the money spent on a case like John Terry's was incredible and ridiculous. But policing language appears to be the new thing. Interestingly, it was an off-duty police officer who noticed what Terry actually said, not Anton Ferdinand or any other player or any ordinary member of the public. And this again, I think, is telling and indicates to me that the police increasingly see it as their job to decide what is acceptable for people to say, which for a supposedly free society is a disturbing development.
Hi, I'm Theodora. Over the course of the London Olympics, Stuart, many people commented on the sportsmanship and clean game played by the female footballers who were able to display their passion for the game without abusing each other. This may be because they were on show to the world, but if it's possible for the game to be played like this, does it detract from the beauty of the beautiful game if players are banned from verbally abusing each other? Secondly, in many places of work, it's unacceptable for a person to verbally abuse another person and can sometimes lead to action being taken against the abuser. Is the football pitch not considered a place of work? So shouldn't footballers be subjected to the same conditions?
It's funny, Theodora, that you use the term verbal abuse, because in the not too distant past, we would never have thought about name-calling between grown men as a form of abuse. That we now use this kind of language is illustrative of the more fragile way we think about ourselves and other people. But to answer your question, I think football players calling each other's names is totally irrelevant as an issue. Unfortunately, football has been politicised, and we get politicians bizarrely discussing the idea that players like Wayne Rooney should be role models to children. I'm happy for my kids to look to Rooney as a role model about how to play football, but any parent that seriously expects him to be a role model about anything else in life, I think should take a long, hard look at themselves. In fact, the very fact that society looks to football and football players, footballers to tackle all sorts of social and political questions, I think is a problem. And rather than dumping everything on the shoulders of football, we should be asking what's wrong with the people running society. What damage, in fact, are they doing to the game by politicising and moralising so much about something that is, after all, just a game? On your question about shouldn't football be treated like any other workplace, well, if I was allowed to slide tackle and do shoulder barges at work and smack my workmates into the office wall, I might agree with you, but obviously I don't do that. Football, it's an aggressive physical battle, and this is actually part of its beauty.
Hi Stuart, I'm Louise. Does the fact that we as a society are becoming increasingly sensitive to racial slurs demean and devalue hardcore racism?
Yes, Louise, I think what racism is and what anti-racism is has become very confused and confusing today. It's become a kind of etiquette or a form of politeness. And as you suggest, society is, I think, becoming increasingly sensitive to offensive words. And I'm genuinely worried that young people in particular who grow up in this type of climate will be encouraged to become thin-skinned, chronically offended victims who increasingly tell tales on one another.
Hi Stuart, my name's Tom. If we look at the history of racism, we can see how the standard of what is considered racist has changed over the years. For example, there was a time when acts of violence against blacks and Asians and the campaigns for deportation of foreigners were considered racist. But in more recent times, smaller matters such as verbal abuse count as racial discrimination and are punishable by law, as we've seen in the John Terry case. Since the standard of what is considered racial discrimination has been raised, do you have any predictions on what could be classed as racial discrimination in, say, 20 to 50 years?
I agree with you, Tom. I think the meaning of racism and anti-racism is very different from what it was in the past. I don't really have time to explain this point properly, but I think the more we encourage people to understand themselves as being abused by offensive words, and the more we encourage people to turn to the authorities every time they hear something that offends them, the more we'll undermine a genuinely free public life. And actually, the more we will encourage the next generation to see other people as a potential threat to themselves, rather than as people that they have something in common with.
Hi Stuart, I'm Chelsea. Well, I do feel that Terry's behaviour was racially offensive and therefore bordering on an intolerable form of harassment. When looking at the situation's social context, I think Terry's choice of words weren't necessarily a true reflection of his actual feelings towards Ferdinand. If Terry was indeed provoked, perhaps he was merely responding towards a volatile situation by displaying a reaction without really thinking. With all this to consider, where do we draw the line on free speech? And isn't it possible that the free speech argument is being used to condone racist behaviour?
Again, your use of the term harassment is interesting, but I haven't got time to go into it. On your question, Chelsea, yes, a society that has genuine free speech would allow racist ideas to exist, but the freedom society gives us would also allow me and you to challenge racist ideas. Today, I don't see any racist ideas being challenged. Just as you see yourself talk about racist behaviour, we seem to have lost the understanding that racism and fighting racism should be about ideas. When we see it as just a form of behaviour, it simply becomes much more about policing people, which to me is the antithesis, the opposite of freedom.
Hi Stuart, I'm Justine. In light of the recent racism allegations within the footballing industry, the media was quick to label the nation's reaction as a public outrage. Do you think this suggests that as a nation we have become too sensitive, causing us to take offence at any opinion which does not match our own? Secondly, Stuart, the decision to hold the UEFA Euro 2012 in Poland and Ukraine prompted speculations of racist, banana-throwing crowds. This prediction contrasted greatly with the reality of minor scuffles and a series of peaceful games. Is there a sense of superiority within Britain that we alone supposedly possess the ideal level of cultural tolerance to be imitated within football stadiums worldwide? Surely the stereotyping of Eastern Europeans as racist football hooligans is just as bad as the stereotyping of black players which dominated British football in the past. Are the anti-racists racist? What do you think?
On your first question, Justine, yes, I think we have become too sensitive as a nation, and I do think we're in danger of creating a situation where more and more people are offended by more and more words. I also think that the hysteria about racism in terms of the Ukrainian and Polish fans in the European Championships was illustrative of the problem with a lot of anti-racism today. As you suggest, there is a peculiar kind of national chauvinism almost now amongst what I'd call the cosmopolitan elite in Britain, who seem to look down their noses at foreigners like Luis Suarez, who they see as being not as anti-racist and tolerant as we are. Tolerant, that is, just so long as they talk and act like them. Otherwise, you may well end up with the police at your door.